everyone, welcome to Collaborwocky, Modus Cooperandi and Modus Institute's conversation series about collaboration and the humanization of work. I'm Tonianne and as usual, joining me is my co-host and partner at Modus, Jim Benson.
Hi there. I'll just take it from that. Today on Collaborwocky, we have a wonderful treat. And we get to actually talk to a group of practitioners who took on a particular challenge that is often just accepted as unfixable, and that's annual reviews. And quite often, annual reviews can be combative, they can be demeaning, humiliating, or just a waste of time. And we're talking today with three people. We'll have them introduce themselves in just a sec, who got together and said, you know, maybe there's something better. And then they went and made that better thing happen. So let's just jump right into the introductions. And we'll start with we're actually blessed with one of our students from our certification program. And that's how we found out about it is he had written it up in one of the comments on one of the units that we had. So Mr. T, if you may, you want to start the introductions, and we'll roll along.
All right, thanks very much, Jim and Tonianne. So my name is Thushyanthan. Outside of very few people, including Adrian, that's how you pronounce my name. The other person is my wife and my mother. So thank you very much for having me on. So I guess just to start it off, just a brief introduction. The three of us, we've been working together for about 5 years, and then over the course of 5 years and 5 performance reviews, that's kind of how our discussion got started, and we worked on something together. So that's a brief introduction from me. So I'll pass it on over to you, Jim, to introduce the rest of the crew.
Okay. Trevor.
Sure. Hi everybody, my name is Trevor Alexander. I formerly worked at the University of British Columbia with Thushyanthan and Adrian. I currently am a media engineer for the Walt Disney Animation Studios in Vancouver.
Awesome. And Adrian.
Yeah, hi, my name is Adrian Wheeler. I'm an educational strategist for the Faculty of Medicine at the University of British Columbia. Formerly, I worked on the same team as Trevor and Thushyanthan as an audiovisual support analyst, again, at the Faculty of Medicine. Awesome. And then the three of us effectively helped support the distributed medical program at the University of British Columbia.
Okay. So when you decided to get together and have this conversation about the performance reviews, what spurred that? And was this a like crying in your beer conversation, or just a hey, this would be cool conversation?
Interestingly, if I remember correctly, it was actually each of us had suggestions on how we could potentially enhance the performance review process, and our team lead thought that was an excellent idea and encouraged us to pursue it. It was our team lead was actually and manager were quite supportive throughout the process, which I think made it a positive experience, at least speaking personally.
Can add some context to that. It happened. I think this is probably just pre-pandemic. This is roughly 2019, I think, if it happened, if I remember correctly. We all have had experiences, and I'm sure everybody listening and yourselves included have all had experience with receiving poor quality feedback. Feedback that was maybe very subjective in nature, that didn't lead to any positive outcome. And I came from a previous job where the feedback culture was very, very rich, very mature, and very well thought out. And I came to our current role and I found it was not the same experience. And I found that I wasn't receiving feedback, generally speaking, until I went into my performance review. And then all of a sudden I was smacked in the face with all of this feedback that I could have actioned throughout the year, but never had an opportunity to. And it's all of a sudden showing up on my quote unquote permanent record. And I didn't like that at all. So I wanted to start to be a part of a feedback change in the culture of our organization. And Adrian and Thushyanthan, just through side of the desk conversations, they had similar experiences, and we could all relate with each other on that, and wanted to start something. And it sort of began initially with a presentation to our group, our team, on how to deliver feedback, what it should look like, sort of provide a somewhat informal, somewhat unofficial kind of framework to make feedback look and sound ideal. And ultimately to achieve a positive outcome, whether it was positive or negative in nature, that something beneficial was going to be derived from it. And yeah, I'll pass it to Thushyanthan, but to add some more context. But that's kind of the original roots of how it came up.
Yeah, thanks, Trevor, for that. So, Jim and Tonianne, I guess we're just providing context here. And it's almost like this annual review. They call it the performance review now, I guess. But it's that Seinfeld episode, it's Festivus, it's the annual airing of grievances and stuff like that. So that's kind of how I had viewed it, because throughout the year, everything's going well, and bam, you get anonymized sort of subjective feedback that actually does not have any sort of subsequent hoped for outcomes. It was more like, so and so did that, wasn't helpful, but there was no option to, provide feedback on how to improve or what can make it better for the team. So, I'm not going to get into the gripes, because that's, not the airing of grievances that we don't need. But this, again, as Trevor mentioned, it's kind of like the side of the desk conversations, and it had been going throughout the years that I was there. It was like, oh, I thought I was doing well. And then it's like, oh, really? You mean you couldn't have told me that earlier? And so as I had conversations with Trevor and Adrian, at that time, we were actually sitting like within 6 inches of each other. So we were able to have these kind of conversations and say, hey, listen, I noticed you did such and such, I was hoping for such and such, and maybe in the future we can do, more other stuff. So that's kind of the context there. Is that sufficient, or would you like more?
Oh yeah. So there's a couple things I really like about both how you all introduced it and how protective you all are about UBC and the culture and the group that you worked with. So I super appreciate that. I want to acknowledge that up front. And the other thing was to note that this wasn't like, you were hiding in a back room saying we're going to overthrow the local government, but more like, hey, it's this could be better, this could be improved, and then you received support in that improvement. And that is the best of all possible worlds, I think, because nothing's going to be perfect when you arrive, but being able to make change is important. And then the second thing is that all three of you, individually and as a group, had the agency to respond to a delta that you saw between the way things are and the way things could be. And that's also kind of rare. So usually in places where you get a end of the year thing, it's one of two things: is people just never bothered to think about how it could be better, or that's actually part of the abuse system of the company. So it's nice that this is the former, and that they gave you the opportunity to work on that. So what were some of the recommendations that you all made to change from status quo to something better?
I think there was kind of two big things we did. And Trevor talked about the first, which was we got together and we put together a presentation for our entire portfolio on giving constructive criticism and providing constructive feedback. And we wanted to highlight the different types of feedback and the differences between, positive and negative feedback, and that both can be constructive and both can be problematic or unhelpful. So the three of us delivered that presentation, which had really good feedback. No pun intended. And then from then on, we wanted to modify a tool. So at the Faculty of Medicine, or at the very least, in the portfolio we worked for, there was a standardized tool called the Performance Development Plan, or the PDP for short. And it was a relatively old document. It had some minor updates as our team lead and manager had tried to kind of make it more efficient and more helpful over the years, but they didn't have really the cycles to do that. And so I think when we proposed, like, hey, we'd like to take on updating this, we were given the opportunity. So the second thing we did was we completely overhauled that document. And it was everything from the fact that it looked like it was written in the 80s, like it was just horribly laid out and antiquated. And Thushyanthan, as you probably know, is an extremely, I guess, organized person, and was able to lay that out in a very, I guess, understandable fashion. We also linked those, the desired learning outcomes with the kind of standard at UBC for like professional development and where you should be headed. And then we went through all of the questions, and some of them are dictated by HR, so there wasn't a whole lot we could do. But for a lot of those questions, we added context. Because as you are no doubt aware, oftentimes questions or surveys or whatnot aren't necessarily crafted to be the most understandable by everyone. So adding a bit of context is helpful. And as part of that, we actually created a second document where we'd filled out examples for every single question and how we'd expect that feedback. And then, yeah, we delivered it to the team. That's kind of a broad overview. Thushyanthan or Trevor, would you like to add a bit more context there?
Yeah, if it's okay, Trevor, I'd like to just jump in here. So Jim and Tonianne, Adrian mentioned that this was used in our portfolio, and our portfolio consists of our manager and down, and it's about 40-ish people across 4 physical locations throughout the province. And it's kind of 2 separate groups in terms of union. So one is like Union 1 and the other one is Union 2. It's a professional group. So this tool that Adrian was mentioning, this performance development tool, was used throughout these 2 groups, and their job descriptions had sort of different competencies that had to be matched up and aligned up. So what Adrian is mentioning is that we had to work within the existing structure of HR and align it so that we could get across through to one set of JDs and across to the other set of JDs, and do it in such a way so that there was alignment between how these things go. And even though, Adrian might have pumped up my tires with all this organizing and stuff, these 2 did a lot of work in the in the background there to, streamline it visually. We tied it back to the job description. Those were, links within the document to the HR pages. And then internally, through our use of Confluence that the entire team uses, we had a little bit more tighter language, sort of, I guess in some sense, ad hoc type of experiences and verbiage to use. So this has only been, I believe, started to be used fiscal or new year 2021. So starting in April of 2021, it's been in use with the groups that have been coming up for performance reviews. So that is a little bit more context. I think I'll pass it to Trevor to add a little bit more if needed.
You guys covered it very well. We were in the beginning stages of kind of also defining a future iteration to what this would look like, adding more on top of it. Something that we hadn't gotten to, but Thushyanthan still with the organization, and Adrian for that matter, could both perhaps look at that. But we were looking at utilizing a survey tool to capture the feedback, because it was in the form of a Word document. And I think we were looking for something that was more provided a better user experience and perhaps a better opportunity for people to analyze the data as well. So UBC, they purchase a survey tool that we could have utilized as well. And that was going to be the next iteration of that PDP tool, was moving it off of a digital Word copy onto a website.
Awesome.
I have a
I
quick
think-
question
oh,
about
go
the
ahead.
frequency. You said that you overhauled the document. I'm wondering if you overhauled the expectation for the feedback.
Yes, we did. So we did that kind of in two ways. One was that aforementioned, I guess, workshop with our portfolio. The second was we did restructure a lot of the questions in such a way to make them so they were asking for constructive feedback. We found that a lot of the questions in their previous form weren't, it was clear they were written with the right intention. But as you know, language can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. And especially in an IT organization, people are quite literal. And, if you ask for brutal feedback, you will get brutal feedback. So we wanted to really craft the language in such a way that it was asking for what we really wanted. And that was that kind of constructive, feedback that was like grounded in reality. So there was if you gave feedback, there was an example as to like where and when this happened, what the effects were and that sort of thing. Go ahead, Thushyanthan.
Yeah, so this is how the three of us will tag team in terms of like questions and answers and stuff. Jim and Tonianne and the rest of the group, I wanted to mention that if it wasn't for these two guys and the others that I worked with, they provided a sense of safety. So in that feedback culture, like where we used to get like, oh, in some senses broadsided by this, without the help of these two, I wasn't previously able to push back and say, no, I don't accept your subjective opinions about this. How is it that you can provide something more constructive? Now, this gave me courage because it was a safe environment, because I had been working with these guys for a long time. And additionally, I was seeking clarity. And I think the whole process of this feedback presentation that these guys did, and looking back on my notes, that was done January 25th, 2021, so much earlier this year, almost a year ago. But what these guys did was provide, I'd like to think of a seed of a new approach to feedback, where it's not just it comes once a year. We're trying to, at least in my interpretation, the goal was to shorten the time between outcomes and the expectations of change and how we can do that change. And throughout, I believe, since the last 10, 11 months, since these guys have done it, there have been initiatives within leadership into providing more transparency. And we are using our technology. We used Confluence, as I mentioned. Now the organization, our unit, is using Microsoft Teams to provide more transparency in terms of the kind of activities that other groups do. So, if I may just speak a little bit more on some sort of tangent, it was, I believe, the feedback really was about fear and not being transparent enough about the existing work that was done by teams. And since I believe one of the factors that led to this was we were all in physically separate locations, so we had no idea what another person does. And everyone was seeking transparency in their annual reviews. They were saying, hey, I need more. But yet no one was willing to step up to do so. So this presentation that the three of us worked on to present at the beginning of the year, really, I believe, was to introduce that seed for the two different unions and their management structures into the broader team to say, hey guys, feedback in the moment is appreciated because we can get at it right away. If we look at it 2 weeks, a month, 3 years, or whatever down the line, we may have lost the kernel of change that we could have done in that moment. That's enough for my talking. I'll give it to Trevor to add some more. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to. Jim, you sort of brought up at the beginning that the idea of PDP and the idea of performance reviews or annual reviews is sort of perhaps was a bygone concept, and that maybe it should be done away with. And I feel like instilling this feedback culture and then reprogramming how we conduct performance could be done. And this was sort of an initial step. Maybe we never thought about the big idea of let's just not have a PDP anymore. Honestly, the university wouldn't let us, but I think that what you indicated there is that providing feedback in the moment and allowing people to action it immediately is more effective than hearing it all at the end of the year. Goal setting should be done throughout the year, and your leadership, or to whom you report to, should be having conversations with you casually all throughout the year to ensure that that is ongoing, rather than done once at the beginning of the year or at the end of the year, and then at the next cycle they check in with you and you're like, oh, how did those goals go? Well, they went terribly because you and I never had conversations about them, and it's hard for me to stay focused when I have all this day-to-day operations to do. Understandable. Maybe we should have made this more of a routine rather than having it be like a check mark that the manager has at the end of the year. Did I check in with everybody on my team at least once? So that feedback portion was the initial step. And I think analyzing it now, the next step that I would have moved on to would have been something about how can we revisit goal setting in an ongoing fashion rather than a once a year. Yeah. And we did have the option of meeting more frequently with our lead. They did provide us the option to say we can do it, quarterly, for example. Some people would elect to do that, some people wouldn't. But I think that even still, it needs to be perhaps less formal and more ongoing. And a good leader can keep track of the outcomes of those conversations to know the next time you speak to that person where they were in the last state, so you can update it for the current state.
Mm-hmm.
Trevor, I really appreciate your term feedback culture. And I'm wondering if you're noticing that there is a generational expectation, whereas millennials are used to more instant gratification, immediate feedback, as opposed to Gen X, where we grew up with the annual performance review. So I'm wondering if that was your experience at your organization.
That's an interesting idea. I think an initial thought that you may be onto something there. I think obviously we'd have to throw a lot more time at that to see if that's a thing. But yeah, I can see how even perhaps going to previous generations, and if we want to compartmentalize it like that, the baby boomers probably did have this sort of waterfall technique to achieving everything that they do, because agile concepts were relatively new, and so they, at the end of the waterfall, is the review of the work that was complete. Was it done well? Yes or no? We checked a few boxes. We move on to the next project. So I think, like you say, with millennials, Gen X, maybe there's some probably overlap there. That the instant gratification, also the quicker turnaround times that we do expect with things like our outputs, there's a lot more demand based on our productivity. That, yeah, you're absolutely right. There could be that we have higher expectations about what we want from our leadership team. We want things to maybe be more casual, less rigorous, and less formalized. So yeah, it's a great idea, Tonianne. Thanks for bringing that up.
I'm going to offer, I guess, a contrasting opinion. As the youngest person on the team, our team actually ranged greatly in age, which was quite interesting. I'm 30. I started on that team when I was 22, and the ages range quite significantly, and so there was a cross-generational component to that team, and I think. There was a stronger, I think culture is probably the big component there. And that's something that, culture is multifaceted, and people bring different ideas from different aspects of their lives. There is that kind of IT culture for sure, which certainly played a large role. But beyond that, there's microcultures as well. And I think there was a microculture on that team in regards to feedback. And the way and how that developed, I'm not sure. The team had been around a lot longer than I had, and there's members on that team who've been there for upwards of 15 years. So I think it's one of the things that we really focused on was that change in culture generally, and regardless of where it came from, was to try to build a culture of safety, primarily to go back to what Thushyanthan was saying. And that was sort of twofold. We realized quite quickly that people really liked anonymity because they were worried about things getting back to them. They wanted to give feedback. And I think generally speaking, the feedback that was given even before we'd made these changes was done so with the best of intentions. It just may not have hit right, I suppose. And part of that was this like fear of revealing yourself, right? And that came from, individuals on the team would get very angry after their PDPs and go on a little bit of a manhunt, as it were, not literally, but they'd be upset and like, who said this about me and that sort of thing. And that, I think, reinforced that culture. So what we were trying to do was break that down. And as Thushyanthan said, shorten the timeline and ensure that things didn't fester, right? Because, if something, if I bump into Thushyanthan today and, he spills his coffee and, if he doesn't say anything about it, in 6 months, Thushyanthan may think I'm the worst person in the world. But if we have that conversation right away and he says, hey, you've done this 3 times in the last week, can you, maybe be a bit more, aware of your surroundings when you're passing by, we can diffuse that situation, we can talk it out, and we can also understand where, each of us are coming from. Maybe I just had, eye surgery and I've got something else going on in my life, right? And that's something we really wanted to instill, and I think that helped a lot. We also took the initiative to start providing feedback in the moment as well, both positive and constructive, and I think that that helped with a bit of a culture change.
Tonianne, is it okay if I respond to your thing about Gen X and
Please.
millennial?
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm not sure that I can really say that. I know obviously Adrian is the youngest in our team, and there was a big age difference. One other thing that these guys touched on really was the microculture, and I'm not sure how that came about, but again, it's almost like we're functioning in the team. Like there was, I think, 4 or 5 of us that were in a broom closet doing our work, and that provided the impetus for that particular microculture. A few buildings away, about like 10 kilometers at the hospital site, there was a slightly bigger room, windowless, but it also provided another microculture. But that also had 2 different teams from 2 different unions, and some groups, because of a certain kind of union or that mentality or whatnot, belong to the okay boomer mindset. Some of it belonged to the slightly younger mindset. And each one of these groups, they actually had, the language, the linguistic component. Even though we had a commonality of the medical terms and terminology that we used to work with, each particular physical location had its own culture. And the age ranges sort of tended to clump together within these kind of physical locations. And I thought that was interesting. I'm slightly older than Adrian, not by much. I think I'm on the cusp of millennial / Gen X. So sometimes I identify with Gen X, sometimes with millennial. I also want instant gratification. But at the same time, if it wasn't for these guys, if it wasn't for my crashing up against Adrian's experiences when he did, I wasn't able to reflect on my actions and my demands and my linguistic components. Because another thing that we talked about here really is the word expectations. And to me, at least what I learned is that expectations are unspoken sort of needs and requests for clarity, for information, for whatever. And those came across in some sense on a generational conflict, but in other senses from that literal physical microculture sort of space. So I guess broadly I can point out and say, yeah, there's a difference between Gen X, millennial, and boomer. But as myself, Trevor, and Adrian, we communicate with the feedback and stuff, I'd like to think of myself now as the human API between technology, between stakeholders, between like IT teams, etc. I'm finding that my language, in some sense, is narrowing down. But sorry, I have airplanes in the sky. But I find that my language is narrowing down. But at the same time, because of its tighter focus, there's generally, I'm doing like airplane stuff. It's much tighter focus on clarity. And that I find can transcend generational sort of stereotypes. Thank you. Over to you.
And so there's going to be so much for the world to unpack from this conversation. The one thing I did want to mention, so we've got the cultures of age, but then you also had the cultures of union, the cultures of different offices, the culture of the university and the university system as a whole, the bureaucracies of all those things stacked on top of each other. And for most people, the weight, the overwhelming existential weight of all of those different organizations makes people say, I'm not touching that. So the safety that you mentioned, which was something that by necessity was collaborative. You had mentioned that you wouldn't have been able to do this alone, but when you had even just a couple of other people, suddenly that became some sort of strength in numbers, collaborative thing. And then when you got in there and had some conversations, clarity became a central part of the conversation. And so I really like that you gave clarity to the existing system, knowing that with that bureaucracy, you couldn't blow it up, but you could make it better. That's so ridiculously rare. And I want you to hear me say that, because I know that you guys are just like, well, yeah, it just made sense. But no, it's actually ridiculously rare. And so the taking the existing questions and saying we can't probably change these questions, but we can make people interact with them better. That is brilliant. That's just plain brilliant. And I think part of it comes from your UX background. So you're like, how can we make the experience of going through this better for people? But I think it also comes from something that's probably just like Adrian said, if you get a whole bunch of tech people in a room, you're not going to have a very good conversation. And guess what? We've had a very good conversation. So that API thing, I think is a thing. And so it's gone through stage 1 through 2021. Is there a group of people that is going to take it and march those other design considerations forward? Have other people seen it and been inspired by it?
Well, that'll be a Thushyanthan question, because 2 of us have left.
I figured it would.
Sorry.
I think you're hitting on to something there, Adrian. Yeah, so as Adrian and Trevor have sort of alluded to, I am the only one left of the original group. And I think, what I'm trying to build now is I'm trying to build champions. I'm not sure like where that goes. Like my background really is about documentation. I love documentation. And because as I articulate and write down the steps and the stuff that I'm doing, it creates this, transparency. I essentially want to walk the talk, and I'm trying to set myself up as a role model. So what I can do, my actual annual review is coming up on Monday, and I'm sure I'm going to get some interesting comments. But again, it's really, in my opinion, it's just not pushing back per se, but really standing up with courage and saying, "Hey, what's this about? I noticed this, and it could have been done better. It could have been done differently." A few. The leadership is still there. So my team lead was there, same as the team lead that started this, and the manager as well. And There is stuff happening. And again, Jim and Tonianne, you probably know the bureaucracy of a university.
Mhm.
Like, I wrote, it's really like hanging out with snails. If you think you're going fast, I think Adrian said you're not going fast enough or
Mm.
something like that. Or if you think it's slow, you're going too fast. Um, so it's happening. And it's really, in my sense, a matter of time. I'm finding that, some individuals may not appreciate what has been set in motion. Um, and it is kind of a scary thing, especially when you're interacting across unions, across different sort of responsibilities and these kind of groups. But as we get together, this is what I feel, and I'm generally an optimist. As we get together and converse and push out and provide feedback, knowing, you know what, I'm not going to get hammered if I say this thing. I'm not going to be stepped upon if I have a quote unquote dissenting opinion. And that's kind of where I'm at right now. There was an allusion to iteration number 2 or n+1 or whatever it is. We're, I think there may be conversations starting in February, March, April for the next fiscal. In my mind, once I see what Monday's session will be like, I'll definitely provide feedback to my lead about what can be done and what sort of needs tweaks, because we haven't seen the full iteration throughout all the 40 people or so. There would be definitely conversations or considerations to be had by leadership about this. Obviously, I would like to step up and provide some sort of feedback, but yeah, I think that's kind of where we're at. Trevor, if you'd like to add more, otherwise the floor is yours.
One thought I had was sort of right at the end of my term at UBC, which was only 2 weeks ago or so, was I was starting to examine revisiting a feedback workshop or presentation, but under the frame of receiving. And this was to, in our initial one, we focused heavily on how you give feedback. We did briefly talk about how you receive it and how you need to do things like remove emotion from the feedback, and you have to be very open-minded. Know that, assume positive intent from the person giving it to you, things like that. But we needed to focus a lot more on the receiving aspect and how you convert feedback to something actionable. And I think that there's something that's a next step for Thushyanthan if he wants to take it on, or at least seek out some fellows on the team that can that are interested and that can help him. And I know that there are still people there that want that. But he should, I would recommend looking at that as a way to continue moving forward on the feedback culture, because if you don't keep reintroducing it as a topic, people are going to forget and revert to their old ways. And it's hard to develop a habit. I heard once that it takes 7 weeks to develop a habit of you doing it every single day. And I know that we weren't delivering feedback in a perfect form every day for 7 weeks. So it's going to take years of hard work and revisiting concepts. And the one other thing I wanted to mention is maybe we didn't touch on it well enough, but we really were supported from a positive and very accepting frame of mind from our leadership team. And we sort of mentioned that, they allowed us to make changes, but they themselves identified that there was a need and were open-minded to doing it. So our leadership team was highly behind our back. And I'm sure if you were to communicate up the chain all the way to our chief information officer, that everybody would agree that there's some opportunity to improve the way that we are reviewing our performance. And as such, there's a lot of opportunity for future improvements. And I think there's always going to be an atmosphere for accepting a new way of doing something, at least from the perspective of trying it. Maybe trying it for a year, seeing how it works, and if it's less successful or not successful, maybe revisiting that. So I know Thushyanthan is at least supported from that aspect too in his future endeavors.
That's awesome.
Thushyanthan, I have a quick question for you. So we know that fear impedes your higher level thinking, your executive functions. with regard to the period leading up to the review or the review period, the actual conversation, and then the results, are you all considering ways to alleviate, if not eliminate, some of the fear employees might bring to this process?
Yeah, so Tonianne, I think that's a really good question. With the departure of these two guys, we've onboarded a couple of new people. Um, and, right off the bat, I'd like to think that there is more talk about this. When I say onboarded new people, I mean onboarded to the Vancouver location. Additionally, to the Victoria location, there's been a couple of new hires as well. These people, these individuals, when they have come on, they've already seen some of the new systems in place, like the more mature Confluence documentation, the kind of conversations we have on Microsoft Teams or Zoom or however we do it. So what I cannot control, or what I'm not sure can be controlled, is what kind of baggage and history they are bringing with them. So some people have been, as they describe it, coming in from more toxic environments. So our environment is a breath of fresh air. Potentially, our environment might be toxic to somebody else, where there might be a bigger breath of fresh air elsewhere. So it's, as we are functioning within this system, we can tweak it to improve ourselves, and do it in such a way that we can take care of the group. And how do we do that? As you alluded to and mentioned, it's really about that sense of safety. And I am sure that the leadership is also stating that, yes, we want open conversations, your ideas are welcome. And yet we cannot do anything about what people bring in. It's like, okay, the perceived status, the perceived power, that differential. If you don't understand how it works within this current microculture, you're interpreting it through the lens of what you had previously experienced, not knowing what is available. So all of those things, I'm finding more and more is conversations. Because I'm primarily remote now, I'm finding that I am reaching out to these individuals that have been onboarded for quick 10-minute chats, 5-minute chats throughout the week, just to say, hey, what's going on? I'm not sure if leadership actually does that, but I want to instill, and I want to continue the work that Adrian and Trevor have been doing, right, about feedback. It's like, if I notice something, it's like, hey, how's it going? Like, have you noticed this thing? What can we improve with our documentation? What can we improve? And really cheering the people on. And in some sense, I guess maybe this will be like a future lesson or learning in the certification program, but at times it can be exhausting, and that's a totally different conversation. But at this moment, I don't find it exhausting. As I reach out to people, again, acting as an API, it's almost like request response. Hey, like 200, okay, you're okay, right? And so trying to instill that, I want to ensure that I'm carrying the legacy that the three of us have brought forth. And I want to ensure that through me and the rest of the team that I work with, the new onboard people have that sense of safety. And that's kind of, where it's at right now. And that's kind of what I can do pending more feedback coming up on Monday.
I wanted to, if I could, oh, sorry, Adrian. I wanted to touch on one thing. Tonianne, you mentioned about fear. And I think one thing that needs to be looked at the culture there is, there's kind of a couple ways. There's probably a few ways you can create fear. And one is you can scare people. You can say, like, you do something wrong, something bad will happen to you. But another way that you can create fear is by overprotecting people and telling them that there's something bad that can happen to you. So I have to protect you from that. And that's where I feel the culture is there. And Adrian also touched on this briefly about how there is a veil of lack of transparency about where the feedback is coming from. So you can't gain context into the feedback. So if the feedback isn't, say, well written enough, or it's not verbose enough, that we can't actually learn anything from it. And I can say that from experience about having been told I did something wrong, but not specific enough to know the exact situation and what I should have done differently, just that I did something wrong. So Thushyanthan can also look at what are ways to further encourage transparency. And Thushyanthan is huge on transparency, coming from I talk with him on the daily, and that's what he wants, like amongst more than anything. Perhaps more than documentation, he wants to be able to see through the lines and see through the walls. So I would encourage him to really nail that down as stop over protecting the people, allow for people to be allow for transparency on where the feedback comes from, and actually encourage conversations, leadership-led conversations between the people that created that feedback, so you can really derive some sort of positive outcome from it. Sorry, Adrian, I apologize for cutting you off.
Excellent point, because that sense of protection can and will lead to learned helplessness versus a sense of agency and engagement. Right. You were going to say something, Adrian. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I guess two quick things. So I think the first is building on what Trevor had said there, was that creating a culture of conversation was really important for us, and breaking down that one-way direction of feedback. And then second is the fear generally is powerful, and it's something that the department as a whole is looking at. I work on, well, I sort of am the staff engagement person for the department as a whole. I helped found a wellness working group as well, and a social committee. And a lot of these initiatives are being driven by management, from the top, where they recognize these issues and want to action them and actively improve the situation. But management needs help from staff, right? If you're the CIO, you're not going to be rewriting a document on feedback, right? Like, you've got more important things to work on. And I think, for me, and one of the takeaways from this particular project was the fact that, oftentimes it just takes someone to say, hey, I'll do it. I've got an idea, let me run with this. And, our managers aren't monsters. Maybe they are somewhere, but by and large, managers are people, team leads are people, they're all people, and everyone's working towards a common goal. And, for the three of us, we're all a little idealistic, probably. We're not afraid of, shaking the boat a little bit and that sort of thing. And quite frankly, and I don't know, I'm not going to speak for Thushyanthan and Trevor, but I was almost surprised by how, there was effectively no resistance. I was prepared for some resistance, and my team lead was like, this is great. I've wanted something like this to happen for years, and I didn't know how to do it. Have at her. And then obviously there was conversations therein where, we had to have a back and forth on how things would work out, and be respectful of his position and what he, his time as well. It'd be great if we could have him do, chats with everyone every day, but obviously that's not tenable. And I think the big takeaway for me is, if you're dealing with issues like this, or you see something that can be changed or improved, try. Don't be paralyzed by fear. There's a reason you were hired for that position. And realistically, if you can add a little bit more value to the whole department, that doesn't look bad. It looks great. So, to me, I'm really thankful to have worked with Thushyanthan and Trevor on this particular project. Both of them brought, incredible backgrounds and experience. That was, I think, it made the project run very smoothly. I think the three of us got along quite well, hopefully. And so again, that made it quite smooth. But I don't think it's not something that someone else couldn't have done. It didn't have to be us. It just happened to be us, in my opinion.
That is awesome, and a beautiful way to not to give anybody more plane references, but a great way to land the plane. You guys, yes, it could have been somebody else, but what we've found is that people are very good at taking their zone of control or their sphere of influence and artificially shrinking it. And you didn't do that. So I appreciate those last two messages, which were basically telling other people, look, if something isn't working quite right, you do have the ability to talk about it. If somebody doesn't have the ability to listen, then that's more information. That's information you can work with. But by and large, what we found across all the teams that we've worked with is that when people just say, we could make this better, no one stands in their way, and people often surprisingly make it very easy for them to do it. So this does conclude the 40 minutes of our 20-minute conversation. And no, this is not unusual for us, I'm afraid. Tony, I'll just thank you first myself and then let Tonianne thank you. But this has been a fantastic conversation. I've sent all sorts of happy, effusive remarks through Slack back at Tonianne while we've been talking. And I appreciate and admire what you all did, and I'm glad now that you are able to take, via your dispersal, are able to take these ideas to other places. Tony?
This has been super fun, and you all have a standing invite to return anytime you want. I would love to hear how this program turns out, whether good, bad, indifference. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks for having
Thank you
us.
for your time.
Nice to see you again, Adrian.
Yeah, hope you're doing well.